Greetings, everyone. Before we begin, I'd love to know where and what time you're listening from. Let me know in the comments. And if you enjoy our stories, leave a like and subscribe so you never miss one. Now, turn off the lights, close your eyes, and relax. The idea to hire a clown was my wife's. We had been arguing for weeks about what to do for Thomas's birthday. He was turning 6 and had been talking about the party he wanted for months. He wanted balloons of every color, a huge cake featuring his favorite superhero, and above all, he wanted all his school friends to come celebrate with him. It was that kind of pure excitement only small children have. That ability to get thrilled about things we adults have learned to take for granted. My name is Billy. I'm 38 years old, and I work as an electrician for an installation company that's been operating in the region for decades. I'm a practical man, one of those guys who believes in what he can see and touch, who fixes problems with his hands and distrusts anything that doesn't have a logical and verifiable explanation. I was never superstitious, never believed in ghosts or monsters under the bed or any of those stories parents tell to get kids to behave. Life had taught me that real dangers were much more mundane. Exposed wires that could electrocute you if you weren't careful. Unpaid bills that piled up until they became impossible debts. Bosses who didn't value your work and fired you when it suited them. Thomas was the light of my life from the moment he was born. I remember the first time I held him in my arms. That early morning in the hospital when my wife was too exhausted to keep her eyes open, and I stood there staring at that tiny being who was somehow my responsibility. He had his mother's eyes, big and expressive, and a way of looking at the world that made me feel anything was possible, that the future was full of promises worth keeping. During the first few years of his life, I found myself doing things I never imagined I'd do. Getting up at 3 in the morning to change diapers without complaining. Learning nursery rhymes that got stuck in my head for days. Building block castles he would knock down laughing, only to ask me to build them again immediately. It was exhausting and wonderful at the same time. That contradiction only parents who have been through it understand. My wife found the ad on one of those local service pages that proliferate on the internet. She showed it to me one night while we were having dinner, after Thomas had gone to sleep with birthday excitement shining in his eyes. The profile showed photos of children's parties, kids smiling next to a clown with colorful makeup, reviews from satisfied parents praising the punctuality and way with kids. The price was reasonable, considerably cheaper than the well-known entertainment companies we had consulted earlier. My wife asked what I thought while I chewed on a piece of chicken and looked at the photos on her phone screen. I told her it looked fine to me, that if the reviews were good there was no reason to be suspicious, that it would probably be better than spending double on a big company that would just send some college student in a costume. That was my first wrong decision, though it would take weeks for me to fully understand it. The day of the party dawned sunny, one of those spring Saturdays that seem specifically designed for outdoor celebrations. I got up early to help my wife with the preparations, inflating balloons until my lungs hurt, hanging garlands from the trees in the backyard, moving tables and chairs around until we achieved the perfect layout my wife had in mind. Thomas woke up around 9, still in his pajamas, and ran down the stairs to see how everything was coming along. His face of excitement when he saw the decorated garden was one of those moments we parents keep in our memory like treasures, little jewels of pure happiness that no photograph can truly capture. He stood at the garden door with his mouth open, looking at the balloons and garlands as if he had entered a magical world that existed only for him. The guests started arriving around 4 in the afternoon, when the sun was at its highest point and the garden had become a cozy space inviting people to stay. Thomas's classmates appeared accompanied by their parents. Some cousins living in the city came with gifts wrapped in shiny paper. The children of friends we had known for years ran around among the adults looking for Thomas to start playing. The garden filled with laughter and children's shouts while we adults gathered near the drinks table, chatting about work and mortgages and home renovations and all those mundane things that fill conversations when you're nearly 40 and have a young child consuming most of your time and energy. The clown arrived exactly at 5 o'clock, with almost surgical punctuality, as if he had been waiting somewhere nearby, counting the minutes until the clock struck the exact hour we had agreed upon. He appeared through the side gate of the garden, the one leading to the back street where we used to park the second car when we had visitors, carrying a small, worn leather suitcase and nothing else. He didn't bring colorful balloons or sound equipment or any of those flashy accessories that usually accompany professional children's entertainers. Just the suitcase, his white costume with red pom-poms that seemed to have seen better days, and makeup that seemed strangely simple to me for someone who supposedly dedicated himself professionally to entertaining kids at birthday parties. I went over to greet him because my wife was busy organizing the final details of the games, and someone had to welcome the entertainer we had hired. I extended my hand, introducing myself as the birthday boy's father, and he shook it with a firmness that surprised me, cold fingers closing around mine for a second longer than necessary before letting go. I asked him if he needed anything to set up, if he wanted a drink before starting, if he preferred I show him where he could leave his things. He shook his head without saying a word, limiting himself to smiling with an expression I still struggled to describe adequately today. It was a wide smile, technically perfect, showing all teeth at the right angle and curving the lips appropriately, but it didn't reach the eyes. The eyes remained fixed, motionless, observing me with an intensity that didn't match the cheerful expression of the rest of the face. It was like seeing a mask of flesh imitating human gestures without really understanding what they meant. An almost perfect imitation that failed in the details you only notice when you pay real attention. I let him set up in a corner of the garden while I went back to the other adults, trying to shake off the uncomfortable feeling that brief encounter had left in my stomach. My brother-in-law, my wife's sister's husband, asked me how the clown seemed while pouring me a glass of lemonade his wife had made that morning. I remember telling him he was a bit weird, but that probably all clowns were if you stopped to think about it. That there was something inherently strange about people who painted their faces and acted foolish to entertain strangers. We laughed at the comment and kept talking about other things, about football and politics and gas prices and a renovation project he was considering for his kitchen. From time to time, I glanced over to where the entertainer was, preparing his things with slow and methodical movements that seemed rehearsed. And every time I found him in the same position, eyes fixed on the area where the kids were playing and that immutable smile frozen on his painted face. The show started around 5:30, when my wife gathered all the kids in a semicircle in front of the clown for his performance to begin. We adults stayed in the background, drinking sodas and watching with that mix of boredom and obligation that characterizes parents at children's parties, keeping an eye on our kids but also on the conversations we were having among ourselves. The clown started with basic magic tricks I had seen hundreds of times in similar performances, handkerchiefs disappearing from one hand to appear in the other, coins emerging from behind the ears of kids sitting in the front row, cards supposedly guessing what someone was thinking. The kind of stuff that would have impressed 3 or 4-year-olds but left the 6 and 7-year-olds making up the majority of the audience that afternoon relatively indifferent. Then he moved on to balloon animals, twisting colored tubes into shapes that barely resembled the animals they supposedly represented. A dog that looked like a deformed sausage, a sword that deflated before the kid could play with it, a flower that lost a petal before he finished making it. The kids lost interest quickly and started dispersing, going back to their games while the clown kept performing for an increasingly smaller audience. Some parents exchanged disappointed looks, probably thinking the same as me, that the money we had paid didn't match the quality of the show we were getting. But the clown didn't seem to care about the lack of attention. He made no effort to regain his audience's interest, didn't raise his voice or make flashier jokes or try any of the strategies a professional entertainer would have employed to win back his crowd. He simply continued with his mechanical routine, as if fulfilling a necessary formality before reaching the part that really interested him. Because at some moment I couldn't pinpoint precisely, he stopped performing for the group and started focusing exclusively on Thomas. It was my wife who pointed it out to me first. She came over to where I was serving drinks for some parents who had just arrived late, and told me in a low voice that the clown was looking at our son a lot, that he hadn't taken his eyes off him for a while in a way that was making her nervous. I turned to check and saw exactly what she described, although a part of me wanted to deny it immediately, to convince myself she was exaggerating or misinterpreting what she saw. Thomas was playing with some friends near the swing set we had installed the previous summer, running after other kids in a game of tag that had them all screaming with excitement, completely oblivious to the attention he was receiving from the other side of the garden. And the clown, standing next to the gift table with a half-inflated balloon in his hands that he seemed to have completely forgotten, followed him with his gaze in a way that made the hair on my arms stand up. When Thomas moved to the left, the clown's head turned to follow him with a precision that seemed mechanical. When my son ran toward the back of the garden, the entertainer's eyes accompanied him without blinking, without missing a single detail of his movements. When Thomas laughed or yelled or talked to his friends, the clown leaned slightly in his direction, as if absorbing every sound coming out of his mouth, filing it away somewhere in his memory for a purpose I couldn't and didn't want to imagine. He didn't touch him or get close to him, or do anything that could be considered objectively inappropriate or threatening. But there was something in that fixed attention, in that constant and immutable observation, that triggered primitive alarms somewhere deep in my brain. In that corner of instinct we inherited from ancestors who needed to recognize predators to survive in a hostile world. I mentioned my concerns to my brother-in-law, who had come over to get another drink and had also noticed the entertainer's strange behavior. We both agreed it was weird, that there was something unsettling about the way he looked at Thomas, but we also agreed it was probably harmless. The clown wasn't doing anything wrong from an objective point of view, he was just odd, and we couldn't kick him out of a kid's party just because he gave us bad vibes. We had no proof of anything, no specific behavior to point out, just an uncomfortable feeling that could be perfectly explained by the fact that clowns are unsettling to many people, even without any particular reason. That was my second mistake, the one that would haunt me for the rest of my life, the one that would wake me up every night with the cold sweat of regret and the certainty that I could have done something different, something that would have changed everything that came after. The party continued relatively normally for the next hour. The kids played hide-and-seek and races and all the games 6-year-olds invent when they have a big yard and sugar running through their veins. We adults talked about the same old things, refreshing our glasses and watching our children with that partial attention characterizing parents when they think everything is under control. The clown kept loitering around the garden with that empty smile never leaving his face, occasionally approaching groups of kids to offer balloons or do some minor trick, but always turning his attention back to Thomas as soon as he had the chance. My wife and I exchanged worried glances several times throughout that hour, but neither of us did anything concrete to address the situation. There was nothing concrete to do, we repeated to ourselves. Just a feeling, a hunch, a discomfort we preferred to ignore because confronting it would have been awkward, because it would have caused a scene, because it probably would have made us look paranoid to the rest of the guests who didn't seem to have noticed anything strange. When it was time for cake, my wife went to the kitchen to get it while I gathered the kids around the main table we had decorated with the superhero tablecloth. Thomas was beaming with happiness, excited to be the center of attention, completely oblivious to anything other than the prospect of blowing out the candles and opening the gifts piling up in a corner of the garden. The other kids crowded around him as we started singing Happy Birthday, their off-key voices mixing with the adults in that joyful cacophony characterizing all children's birthday parties. My wife came out of the kitchen with the cake in her hands, 6 lit candles casting an orange glow over my son's smiling face. Thomas clapped with excitement upon seeing it. A chocolate cake with the image of his favorite superhero we had ordered weeks ago. Everything was perfect, exactly as we had planned. That was when the clown approached my wife and whispered something in her ear. I saw her frown slightly, processing what she had just heard, and then nod with a gesture that seemed more out of politeness than conviction. She turned to me with an expression I couldn't interpret at that moment. She explained that the entertainer had forgotten some special candles in his car, ones that made colored effects when you blew them out, and that he wanted to go get them so Thomas could use them instead of the normal candles. It sounded reasonable. It sounded like something a professional entertainer would do to impress the birthday boy, to make the moment of blowing out the candles more special. It didn't occur to me to ask why he hadn't brought those candles from the beginning, why he had left them in the car if they were part of his show. The clown approached Thomas and knelt in front of him, getting down to his eye level for the first time all afternoon. He asked him if he wanted to help him look for the special candles, explaining it would be part of a surprise he had prepared just for him, that it was a secret between the two of them. Thomas looked over to where my wife and I were, seeking permission with those big eyes he had inherited from his mother, and I nodded because no reason occurred to me to refuse. The car was on the side street less than 20 yards from where we stood. It would take a minute, maybe 2 at most. I could see the garden gate from where I stood. Nothing could happen in a minute, I told myself. Nothing bad could happen in broad daylight with dozens of people around. I saw my son take the clown's hand, his small, trusting fingers disappearing inside that white glove stained with paint residue. I saw them walk together toward the garden gate, Thomas doing little jumps of excitement while the clown advanced with slow, measured steps. I saw the afternoon sun entering through the open gate, casting their elongated shadows on the grass. I saw Thomas turn his head to look at me one last time before disappearing around the corner, smiling with that innocent smile I still see every night when I close my eyes. And then I didn't see anything else. 5 minutes passed before someone asked where they were. My mother-in-law wanted to start cutting the cake and didn't understand why the birthday boy hadn't returned yet. I went out to the street expecting to find them by the car, but the street was completely empty. There was no car parked where the entertainer had supposedly left his. No suitcase, no clown, no trace that anyone had been there. I called my son's name with a voice starting to tinge with panic. I ran up and down the street, looking behind hedges and dumpsters. I hoped Thomas would appear running from some corner, laughing at the prank. But the minutes passed and silence remained the only answer. The police arrived that same night. They searched the house, the garden, the neighborhood streets. Security cameras from a nearby shop captured some footage of the clown walking hand in hand with a child, but always from behind or from angles making it impossible to distinguish his features. It was as if he knew exactly where the cameras were. The service ad disappeared from the internet the next day. The reviews, the profile, everything vanished. Technicians tried to trace the origin but only found dead ends. Whoever had created that page knew exactly how not to be found. The following weeks were hell. My wife and I stopped sleeping, stopped eating, stopped being the people we had been. The house became a mausoleum where every room contained memories that hurt to look at. Thomas's toys exactly as he had left them, his untouched room, the garden where remnants of decorations still remained. There were search parties, posters with Thomas's photo on every lamppost, interviews with local media. But days turned into weeks and weeks into months, and silence remained the only answer. No call, no body. Just the void, the uncertainty, the torture of imagining 1,000 different scenarios every day. It was during the 3rd month that I started investigating on my own. The police had told me not to interfere, but I couldn't wait. I couldn't sit in a house full of toys my son would never touch again. I started looking for similar cases online. What I found took away the little sleep I still managed to get. There were dozens of cases scattered all over the geography. Always the same pattern: a birthday party, a hired clown, a child disappearing without a trace. Investigations never went anywhere. At first I thought it was an organized ring, but the more I investigated, the more impossible that explanation became, because the cases weren't limited to the internet era. I found newspaper clippings from the 70s describing identical disappearances. I found articles from the 50s, the 40s, the 30s. I even found references dating back to the early 20th century. More than 100 years of unsolved cases. More than 100 years of children vanishing hand in hand with a smiling entertainer while their parents watched doing nothing. No human being could have been active for more than a century. No criminal organization could have maintained the same modus operandi for so long. There was something else, something escaping any rational explanation. That was when I started looking for photographs. Historical archives sometimes included images of the cases. They were poor quality photos, blurry from the passage of time. But in many of them, partially visible in the background, appeared a figure that seemed disturbingly familiar to me. A man dressed as a clown, watching from a calculated distance. The first time I saw him clearly was in a photograph from 1923. I felt the ground open beneath my feet. It was the same one. Not similar, but exactly the same clown who had come to my son's party 80 years later. The same makeup, the same posture, the same empty smile. Even the suitcase looked identical. I found more photographs. One from 1947 where a 5-year-old girl disappeared. One from 1962 where a boy vanished during a fair. One from 1978 where 3 siblings disappeared in a single afternoon. In all of them, always in the background was him, watching, smiling, waiting. Whatever had taken my son wasn't a man. It was something different, something that had been hunting children for more than a century, perfecting its method. It adopts the form of a clown because it's the perfect form to approach children. A disguise allowing it to be invited into its victims' homes by the parents themselves. After discovering the truth, I started seeing him everywhere. The first time was a reflection in a store window. I turned sharply, but there was no one. The second time was in a family photo from our beach vacation. In the background of the image, partially hidden behind a parasol, was a figure dressed as a clown looking toward where Thomas was playing. I looked at the photograph again the next morning, and the figure was no longer there. But I knew what I had seen. The clown had been following Thomas long before the party. He had been watching us for months, waiting for the perfect moment. The appearances became more frequent. I saw him in the shadows of the garden where my son had disappeared. I saw him in supermarket aisles, always about to disappear around a corner. I saw him in my dreams, kneeling in front of me, extending a gloved hand. My wife thought I was going crazy, but I knew what I saw was real as the pain I felt every morning. One night, approximately a year after the disappearance, I received a message on my phone from an unknown number. It was 3 a.m, and I was sitting in Thomas's room, surrounded by his toys. The message contained no text, only an attached photograph. It was Thomas. My son, clearly a year older than when I last saw him, sitting on a wooden chair in a room I didn't recognize. The walls were gray, windowless. He was wearing the same superhero t-shirt he wore on his birthday, although now it was too small for him. He was smiling, but it wasn't the smile I remembered. It was an empty, mechanical smile that didn't reach the eyes. And behind Thomas, with a gloved hand resting on his shoulder, was the clown, looking directly at the camera, smiling. Below the image was a message: "Thanks for the gift." I called the police immediately, but the number didn't exist. Technicians analyzed the photograph but found nothing. It was as if it had been sent from a place appearing on no map. 3 years have passed since Thomas's birthday. My wife left me 18 months ago, unable to keep living with someone who had become a shadow obsessed with ghosts. I don't blame her. I don't recognize myself either when I look in the mirror, but I can't stop. I can't stop investigating, looking for connections between cases no one else sees, collecting photographs where the same smiling figure always appears. I know I'm chasing something I can't catch, something that has existed for longer than any human being can comprehend. And the clown knows it. He knows I'm looking for him. I know because he keeps appearing before me more and more frequently. Sometimes I see him at the end of the street when I leave the house. Sometimes I find him sitting on the park bench where I used to take Thomas to play. Always at a distance, always smiling, always watching me with that infinite patience of someone who has all the time in the world. I think he enjoys my suffering. I think it's part of what feeds him, the pain of the parents he left behind. Every time I wake up after dreaming of Thomas's empty smile, I know he is somewhere, absorbing my agony. But I'm not going to give up. I'm not going to stop looking, because somewhere in that gray room I saw in the photograph, my son still exists. And as long as the slightest possibility of finding him exists, I will keep going, even if that means spending the rest of my life chasing a monster that has been hunting children for more than 100 years. Even if that means seeing his empty smile every time I close my eyes. Because Thomas is waiting for me somewhere, and his father isn't going to abandon him. Never. I wasn't expecting to find anything special that night. I'd been using the app for weeks without much enthusiasm, swiping left with a monotony that had become a bedtime routine. My name is Patrick. I'm 35 and I work as a data analyst at a consulting firm that takes up 3 floors of an office building downtown. It's the kind of job that sounds impressive when you describe it in casual conversation, but actually consists of spending 8 hours a day staring at spreadsheets and churning out reports that probably no one will read with the attention they deserve. I've been single for 2 years, ever since my last relationship ended, the way relationships that have dragged on too long always do, with exhausted conversations, awkward silences, and the mutual certainty that staying together was worse than breaking up. Living alone has its perks. Or so I told myself every night when I came back to an empty apartment where no one was waiting for me. I could watch whatever I wanted on TV, eat dinner at any hour, leave my clothes wherever I felt like without anyone nagging me. But it also had its downsides, especially in those dead hours between dinner and sleep, when the silence of the apartment became too dense and the walls seemed to close in imperceptibly until I felt like I was suffocating. It was during one of those nights that I downloaded the dating app, more out of boredom than any real hope of finding someone. The first few weeks were exactly what I expected. Profiles that looked like they were ripped from stock photo catalogs, bios full of cliches about travel and adventure, conversations that started with enthusiasm and died after 3 or 4 messages when neither of us found anything interesting to say. I was about to give up and delete the app when I matched with her. Her profile was different from everything I had seen until then. 3 photos where she appeared smiling in everyday places. A coffee shop with afternoon light pouring through the window. A park that looked vaguely familiar. A cobblestone street that could be in any old neighborhood in the city. There were no studied poses or exaggerated filters or any of those tricks people use to look more interesting than they are. Just a woman of about 28 with brown hair tied back in a ponytail. Light eyes that seemed to look directly at the camera with a mix of curiosity and shyness, and a smile that had something melancholic about it, though I couldn't explain why it gave me that impression. Her bio was brief and simple. She liked classic cinema, night walks, and conversations that lasted until dawn. There were no motivational quotes copied from the internet or lists of impossible requirements for potential suitors. Just a few lines suggesting someone looking for real connection in a world of superficial interactions. I liked her without thinking too much about it, and when the app notified me that we had a match, I felt something resembling excitement for the first time since I had started using that platform. I messaged her that same night with a simple line, something about a movie from the 40s I had seen recently that I thought she might like based on her profile. She replied a few minutes later with a witty comment about the director that made me genuinely smile at my phone screen. And that's how it all started, with an exchange of messages about movies that soon drifted toward other topics while hours passed without either of us seeming to want to end the conversation. Her name was Vera, or at least that was the name on her profile. Over the next few weeks, we held long, deep conversations that stretched until the early hours. Those hours when the city falls silent, and it feels like only you and the person on the other side of the screen exist. She told me she worked from home as a freelance graphic designer, that she had studied fine arts but ended up in design because paying rent was more urgent than chasing artistic dreams. She told me she hadn't been living in the city long, that she had come looking for a change of scenery after a rough personal patch she preferred not to talk about yet. She told me her apartment was a few blocks from mine, in an old red brick building near the park where I sometimes went for walks when I needed to clear my head. We even joked about the possibility of having crossed paths on the street without knowing it. 2 strangers walking in opposite directions, unaware that fate would unite them through an app on their phones. The idea had a romantic quality I liked. That feeling that maybe someone was waiting for you right next door without you knowing it. We talked about everything during those nights that seemed endless. About our families and the complications that come with relationships with parents who don't quite understand you. About our deepest fears, the ones you don't share with anyone because they make you feel vulnerable. About what we expected from the future. About the dreams we had abandoned, and the ones we still kept hidden in some corner of our minds. About the little things that made us happy. The smell of coffee in the morning, streetlights reflecting in puddles after the rain, the sound of the city when everyone sleeps, and only the night owls and insomniacs remain. Vera seemed to understand me in a way no one had before. not even my ex after a 4-year relationship. She knew exactly what to say when I felt frustrated with work, how to make me laugh when the conversation got too serious, when to push for me to share something I struggled to express, and when to back off to give me space. Every time I finished a conversation with her, I was left wanting more, counting the hours until the next message, checking my phone compulsively in case she had written something new. I started to think I had found someone special, someone who saw me as I really was behind the masks we all wear in daily life, someone with whom I could be completely honest without fear of judgment. After 2 weeks of conversations that had filled the void of my lonely nights, I suggested meeting for coffee in person. It seemed like the logical step, the natural progression of what we were building together. She accepted delightedly, or so it seemed from the tone of her messages full of smiley emojis, and we set a date for the following Saturday at a downtown cafe we both knew. I spent the whole week nervous, choosing what clothes to wear, mentally rehearsing conversations I hoped to have, imagining what it would be like to see her in person for the first time. Saturday morning, while getting ready to leave with a mix of anticipation and nerves I hadn't felt in years, I received a message from her. It said she wasn't feeling well, that she had woken up with a sore throat and some fever, and that she preferred to leave it for another day so as not to infect me. It seemed reasonable, though the disappointment felt like a weight in my stomach. People get sick and these things happen, I told myself, trying to be convinced. I wished her a speedy recovery, recommended tea with honey and rest, and we rescheduled for the following Wednesday at the same place. On Wednesday, she texted me an hour before the date saying an urgent work problem had come up, an important client who needed a design finished that same night and whom she couldn't afford to lose. I understood again, though frustration was starting to build somewhere in my chest. Unforeseen events happen, especially when you freelance and depend on keeping clients happy to pay the bills. We rescheduled for the following weekend, and she was profusely apologetic, promising that this time nothing would stop us from seeing each other. Friday night, she canceled on me again. The excuse this time was a relative who had come to visit without warning, an aunt who lived in another city and was passing through, and with whom she had to stay because they hadn't seen each other for years. I started to feel genuinely frustrated, but I tried not to pressure her. Maybe she was shy and the idea of meeting in person made her nervous. Maybe she was afraid reality wouldn't live up to the conversations we had held, that upon seeing each other face to face, the magic would break somehow. I had felt that too at some point, so I could understand it even if I struggled to accept it. But the cancellations continued over the next 3 weeks with a regularity that was starting to look suspicious. There was always something preventing our meeting. Some unforeseen event always popped up just when we were about to see each other. A flu that wouldn't quite go away and kept her in bed. An urgent project requiring all her attention over the weekend. A pipe breakdown in her apartment she needed to supervise while plumbers worked. The excuses were different every time, but the result was always the same. We never saw each other, never managed to meet in the physical world that existed beyond our phone screens. The strange thing was she kept talking to me every day as if nothing was happening. She kept showing interest in my life, asking questions about my work and my plans, sharing details of hers that seemed completely normal. It was like having a relationship with someone who existed only in digital format, someone who seemed very real when I read her messages, but never materialized in the physical world where I lived and breathed and hoped to find her. I started to suspect something didn't add up, that maybe I was being taken for a ride in some way I didn't quite understand, that maybe she wasn't who she said she was. I had heard stories about fake profiles on dating apps, people using photos stolen from the internet to create fictitious identities with which they deceived strangers. Catfish, they called it. People who, out of boredom or more sinister motives, dedicated themselves to building fake relationships with real people who didn't know they were talking to a digital ghost. One night after another last-minute cancellation left me sitting alone in the cafe where we had agreed to meet, I decided to investigate on my own. I saved one of her profile photos to my computer and uploaded it to an image search engine to see if it appeared anywhere else on the internet. It was a trick I had read in some article about how to spot fake profiles. a way to check if the photos someone used were really theirs or had been stolen from somewhere else. The results took a few seconds to load while I held my breath in front of the screen, expecting to find the Instagram profile of some influencer whose photos had been stolen to create Vera. But when the results appeared, I felt my stomach drop to my feet and a chill ran down my spine until the hair on the back of my neck stood up. The photo appeared in a local newspaper article dated 2 years ago. The headline spoke of a traffic accident on a country road on the outskirts of the city, at a dangerous curve that had already claimed several victims over the years. A 28-year-old woman had died instantly when her car went off the road for reasons the investigation couldn't determine with certainty, and crashed into a tree with a violence that left no chance of survival. The article included a photograph of the victim provided by the family, the same photograph I had seen dozens of times on the dating app profile. The same smile, the same light eyes, the same brown hair tied back in a ponytail. The woman I had been talking to every night until dawn for weeks had been dead for 2 years. I searched for the other photos from her profile with hands starting to tremble over the keyboard, desperately hoping to find some proof I was wrong, that there was a logical explanation for all this. But they all appeared in the same place, on her Facebook profile, which remained active as a memorial page where friends and family left messages on significant dates. Happy birthday wherever you are, we miss you. You'll always be in our hearts. The messages stretched back over 2 years, testimonies from real people mourning someone who had died long before I matched with her on a dating app. I froze in front of the computer screen, not knowing what to do or what to think. The room seemed to have suddenly run out of air, and I could hear the beat of my own heart pounding in my ears with an intensity that was almost painful. I tried to look for a logical explanation that made sense, some rational theory I could cling to so as not to lose my sanity. Someone had stolen her photos to create a fake profile. It was the only reasonable possibility. A particularly elaborate catfish who for some reason had chosen to use a dead woman's identity to deceive strangers on the internet. But then I started rereading our conversations with fresh eyes, looking for inconsistencies I hadn't noticed before because I had no reason to look for them, and what I found made the fear transform into something deeper, something more akin to the terror I had felt as a child when waking up in the middle of the night, convinced there was something hidden in the closet. The details Vera had told me about her life fit too well with the reality of a woman who had been dead for 2 years. She had told me about an old red brick building near the park where she supposedly lived. I searched for it on Google Maps with my heart beating in my ears so hard I could barely concentrate. The building existed. I could see it on Street View exactly as she had described it. But the windows were boarded up with wooden planks nailed from the inside, and a faded sign on the door indicated it was slated for demolition by municipal order due to structural problems. According to records I found after an hour of frantic searching, the building had been abandoned for more than 3 years, even before Vera died on that country road. She had told me about a coffee shop where she liked to work in the afternoons, a place with large windows and good natural light I had assumed existed somewhere in the city. I searched for the name she had given me and found online reviews speaking of the place in the past tense, lamenting that it had closed years ago due to financial problems. The building where it was located had been converted into a clothing store that had nothing to do with the description Vera had given me. She had told me details about my own neighborhood that had seemed charming at the time, observations about shops and restaurants proving she really lived near me. But now I realized some of those places no longer existed, that they had closed or changed names long ago, and that only someone who had known the neighborhood years back could describe them the way she had. It wasn't a catfish, it couldn't be. An imposter using stolen photos couldn't know those details, couldn't describe places that no longer existed as if they were still there, couldn't talk about a neighborhood that had changed so much in recent years, with the familiarity of someone who had known it before it changed. Panic took hold of me completely. I slammed the laptop shut as if the screen could bite me, as if by distancing myself from the information I could make it stop being real. I grabbed my phone with trembling hands and opened the app where our conversation still was. Hundreds of messages accumulated over weeks of nightly chats that now seemed completely different. I deleted the conversation without rereading it, unable to look again at the words of someone who had supposedly been 6 feet under for 2 years. I removed the match by swiping left on her profile with a sharp gesture meant to be final. I uninstalled the app from my phone and deleted it from the trash too, as if erasing every digital trace could protect me from something clearly escaping the rules of the world I knew. I told myself it was a sick joke, that someone was having fun at my expense, that there had to be a rational explanation for it all, even if I couldn't see it yet. I tried to sleep that night, but couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face smiling in the app photos. The same face appearing in the newspaper article about the accident. The face of a dead woman who had been writing to me for weeks, telling me things about her life, making me believe we had something special, that we had found a connection very few people are lucky enough to find. Around 3 a.m, after hours of tossing and turning in bed without managing to fall asleep, my phone vibrated on the nightstand. The sound startled me so much in the silence of the apartment I almost knocked it to the floor trying to pick it up. It was a message from an unknown number I didn't have saved in my contacts, a series of digits I didn't recognize and that didn't correspond to anyone I knew. I opened it with fingers trembling so much I had to try 3 times before managing to unlock the screen. The message said, "Why did you delete me?" There were no question marks. There was nothing else. Just that accusatory sentence glowing on my phone screen in the middle of the night. 5 words turning the abstract fear I had felt until then into a completely real and present terror. I felt the air grow dense around me, the room walls closing in on me as if the apartment had decided to expel me. I typed back asking who it was, though deep in my gut I already knew the answer. I didn't want to believe it, but I knew with a certainty, leaving no room for doubt. The answer arrived in seconds, as if waiting for my question, as if knowing exactly what I was going to type before I typed it. "It's me. I thought we had something special." I jumped out of bed, tripping over the sheets that had tangled around my legs during the hours of insomnia. I turned on every light in the apartment one by one, the bedroom, the hallway, the living room, the kitchen, the bathroom, as if light could protect me from something clearly not belonging to the world that light illuminates. The next message arrived before I could think what to do, before I could decide whether to reply or throw the phone out the window and pretend none of this was happening. "I know where you live. I've seen you many times from my window. You live right across the street." I approached the living room window with my heart racing, beating so hard I could feel it in my temples and fingertips. The curtains were open because I never closed them, because my apartment was on a 4th floor and I had always thought no one could see inside from the street. Across from my building, on the other side of a narrow street that barely had traffic during the day and none at night, was the abandoned red brick building. The building where Vera supposedly lived. The building that had been empty for years, awaiting a demolition that never quite arrived. And then I saw it. In one of the 3rd floor windows, behind glass dirty and cracked from years of neglect, was a figure. A pale, motionless silhouette that seemed to look directly toward my window, toward the apartment where I stood with the phone still in my hand, unable to move, unable to look away from something that shouldn't be there because that building had been empty for years, and no one could be inside. The phone vibrated again in my hand, and the sound sent a chill through me so intense I thought for a moment I was going to faint. The message said, "I see you now." I backed away from the window abruptly, tripping over the coffee table and knocking a pile of magazines I hadn't read in weeks to the floor. I closed the curtain so hard I almost ripped the rod from the wall, pulling the fabric until not a sliver remained where streetlight, or the gaze of whatever was watching me from the building across, could enter. I spent the rest of the night locked in the bathroom, with the light on and the door bolted, sitting on the cold floor with my back against the tub, and my phone turned off in my pocket because I couldn't bear the idea of receiving another message. I didn't sleep a second, listening to every creak of the apartment, convinced something was trying to get in, waiting for dawn like a castaway waits to see land after days adrift. When daylight started filtering through the small bathroom window, I gathered the courage to leave my hiding place. I approached the living room window with cautious steps, parting the curtains slightly with 2 fingers while holding my breath. The building across seemed empty under the morning light, its windows dark and silent like the eyes of a corpse. There was no figure on the 3rd floor, No silhouette watching me from behind the dirty glass, just the usual abandoned building, waiting for a demolition that might never come. The next day I went to the police and told them everything that had happened, feeling like a lunatic as the words left my mouth. I showed them the messages from the unknown number on my phone. That night's conversation I had saved as proof I wasn't making anything up. They looked at me with a mix of skepticism and concern, as if not knowing whether to believe me or recommend I visit a mental health professional. They investigated the number, but it was impossible to trace. It wasn't registered to anyone's name, and the carrier had no record of its existence. They searched the abandoned building with flashlights and trained dogs, looking for any sign someone had been living there. They found nothing except rubble, trash accumulated over years, and graffiti from teenagers who had probably broken in to explore before the windows were boarded up. They told me it was probably someone playing a very elaborate prank on me, maybe someone who knew me and wanted to scare me for some reason I would have to figure out. They told me to try to forget it and go on with my normal life. But I couldn't forget it. I knew what I had seen that night in the window, the motionless silhouette watching me from a building where supposedly no one was. I knew the messages were no joke, that no prankster could have known the things Vera knew about my neighborhood, about places that no longer existed, about a life that had ended 2 years before she started writing to me. I tried to return to my routine over the following weeks. Go to work, buy groceries, watch TV at night. All those mundane activities filling the days of normal people who haven't been contacted by ghosts through dating apps. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was constantly watching me, an invisible presence I sensed every time I passed near a window or walked down empty streets after dark. That was when I decided to investigate further. If what happened to me was real, if I had truly been talking to the ghost of a dead woman, then maybe I wasn't the only one. Maybe there were others like me, other people who had experienced something similar and could help me understand what was happening. I started searching the internet, in forums about paranormal phenomena and unexplained experiences people shared under pseudonyms because they were afraid no one would believe them. What I found confirmed my worst fears and added new ones I hadn't contemplated. There were dozens of testimonies from men telling stories disturbingly similar to mine. Matches on dating apps with women who seemed perfect. Deep conversations creating connections that seemed real. Constant cancellations every time they tried to meet in person. And then, when they investigated their matches, they discovered the women they had been talking to had been dead for years. Traffic accidents, suicides, sudden illnesses, unsolved murders. All had died alone, many in circumstances suggesting they hadn't had time to say goodbye to anyone. And all continued seeking connection after death, using dating apps as portals to contact the living, choosing lonely men like me who were desperate enough for company not to ask too many questions. Most terrifying were the testimonies of those who had tried to cut contact. Stories of men who had deleted conversations and removed matches just like me, and who had then started receiving messages from unknown numbers. Stories of figures in windows, of feelings of being constantly watched, of nightmares repeating night after night. Some had managed to escape by moving to other cities, cutting all contact with their previous life. Others hadn't been so lucky. I found the case of a man who had disappeared without a trace, 3 months after his experience with a ghost profile. His car appeared parked next to an abandoned building where the woman he had been talking to supposedly lived. But of him, they never found a single trace. I found another case of a man committed to a psychiatric ward claiming she visited him every night, sitting at the foot of his bed and staring at him for hours without saying anything, waiting for something he didn't understand. And I found the case of a man who had committed suicide, leaving a note explaining he couldn't go on living with the certainty that she would never leave him alone, that he preferred to die than continue being watched by something that didn't belong to this world. All of them had experienced the same thing as me. All had tried to escape the same way, and all had failed in different but equally horrible ways. I looked for patterns among the cases, trying to find something to help me understand what these dead women wanted, still seeking company among the living. And what I discovered froze my blood in a way none of the individual testimonies had managed. All had died alone, All had died unexpectedly, without time to say goodbye to anyone, without closing the pending matters every life accumulates. Sudden accidents, fulminant illnesses, violence that surprised them when they least expected it. And all had been lonely people in life. Women who lived alone, worked from home, had few friends and distant families with whom they barely maintained contact. They sought the same thing in death they had sought in life: connection, company, someone to see them and listen to them and make them feel they weren't completely alone in a world that had ignored them. And when they found someone who seemed willing to give it to them, someone as lonely as them who wouldn't ask too many questions, they weren't willing to let him go. I moved apartments 2 weeks after discovering all that. I found a studio in another neighborhood of the city, as far as possible from that red brick building that kept appearing in my nightmares every time I managed to fall asleep. I changed my phone number, deleted all my social media accounts, eliminated any digital trace that could connect me to the person I had been before matching with Vera. During the first few months in my new apartment, I started to believe I'd managed to escape. I received no more messages from unknown numbers, saw no more figures in windows watching me, felt no more invisible presence chasing me for weeks after that night. I started sleeping better, eating regularly, gradually returning to a life that could be considered normal if you didn't pay too much attention to the shadows I still saw occasionally out of the corner of my eye. But then small things started happening that I couldn't explain. Objects appearing in places where I didn't remember leaving them. The feeling that someone had been in my apartment while I was at work, even though nothing was missing and the locks remained intact. Notes of perfume that seemed vaguely familiar floating in rooms where there shouldn't be any smell. And one night, while checking email on my computer, a notification appeared on the screen. A dating app I didn't remember installing informed me I had a new match. The profile was different. The name was different. The photos seemed taken in other places, with other clothes, with another hairstyle. But the eyes were the same. The smile was the same. And the first message appearing on the screen said exactly what I feared it would say. I've missed you. 6 months have passed since then. I haven't moved again because I know it would be useless, that she would find me just as she found me the first time. I live in a state of constant paranoia that has become my new normal, avoiding windows after dark, sleeping with all lights on, checking locks dozens of times before bed. I don't use dating apps, I don't use social media. I don't use anything that can connect me to the digital world where she seems to move with an ease we, the living, don't have. Sometimes in the middle of the night, I wake up with the absolute certainty that there is someone on the other side of the curtain. I can feel her presence as a weight in the air, a density that shouldn't be there but is as real as the walls of my apartment. I never dare to look. I never pull back the curtain to check if someone is out there watching me, because I know what I would find if I looked, and I know that once I see her, I won't be able to stop seeing her ever again. She told me once she liked night walks, and I know she keeps taking them, walking empty streets after everyone has gone to sleep, searching for me with a patience only those no longer limited by time possess. I know someday she'll get tired of waiting. I know someday she'll find a way to be with me forever, to complete the connection we started building during those weeks of nightly conversations that now seem as distant as a dream from which I cannot wake. And worst of all is that a part of me, a small, dark part I try to ignore every day, still misses her, still remembers how good it felt to talk to someone who seemed to truly understand me, who made me feel less alone in a world where loneliness had become my most faithful companion. Maybe that's why I haven't left the city. Maybe that's why I'm still here waiting for something I don't dare name. Because she was right about one thing. We had something special, and the dead don't forget. The train was 40 minutes late that December night. The commuter station was practically deserted at that hour, with barely a dozen passengers scattered along the platform, each taking refuge in their own bubble of impatience and fatigue. I was returning from visiting my parents in the town where I grew up, a weekend trip I made every 2 months since moving to the city with my wife Elena and our son Lucas, who had just turned 6. The night chill crept under my coat and made me shiver as I checked my phone for the umpteenth time, hoping for some update on the delay. The station was one of those old buildings that had survived several renovations without losing its original character. The wooden benches were worn by decades of use. The wrought iron lampposts cast circles of yellowish light on the cracked tile floor, and the glass and metal roof let in the sound of the rain that had started falling minutes earlier. There was something melancholic about that place, an atmosphere of perpetual waiting that seemed to permeate every corner. The billboards on the walls showed products from past seasons, as if time there passed slower than in the rest of the world. That was when I saw him for the first time. An old man sitting on the bench furthest down the platform, completely motionless, hands resting on a dark wooden cane. He must have been over 70, maybe 80, with completely white hair falling over his forehead in messy strands and an unkempt beard covering his sunken cheeks. He wore clothes that seemed from another era, a three-piece suit with a vest and tie of a cut that hadn't been worn in decades. The fabric was worn but clean, as if those garments had been cared for with dedication over many years. But what caught my attention wasn't his anachronistic appearance, but the fact that he seemed to be talking to himself. His lips moved constantly, forming words I couldn't quite hear from where I stood, with a rhythmic cadence reminiscent of a prayer or a chant. I wouldn't have paid him any more attention were it not for what happened next. A young woman waiting near him, absorbed in her cell phone, suddenly looked up as if something had caught her attention. I saw her visibly pale even from the distance separating us, and her expression went from boredom to panic in a matter of seconds. She got up so abruptly she dropped her purse and walked away, almost running toward the other end of the platform, without bothering to pick up her belongings. The old man didn't even seem to notice. He kept murmuring, gaze fixed on some point in the void, completely oblivious to everything around him. Curiosity won over prudence. There was something about that scene that didn't fit, something awakening a deep unease inside me. I approached slowly, pretending to check the information board near his bench. As I closed the distance, his words started becoming audible, first as an indistinct murmur, then as syllables starting to form recognizable patterns. And what I heard stopped me dead, rooting me to the ground as if my feet had grown roots. He was reciting names. Dozens of names, one after another, in a continuous murmur that didn't seem to require pauses for breath. Men's names, women's names, some common and others I had never heard. Names sounding ancient and names that could belong to anyone on the street. And next to each name, a date. Always a future date, days and months that hadn't arrived yet, pronounced with the same certainty with which one would recite historical dates etched in books. I stood paralyzed, unable to move or look away. The cold of the platform seemed to have intensified around me, and I could feel my heart beating hard against my ribs. The old man continued with his litany for several minutes, names and dates following one another in an endless chain, while I remained there like a spectator, trapped in a play I hadn't chosen to witness. Then he stopped. The silence that followed was so sudden and absolute it seemed to have its own weight, a tangible presence filling the space between us. Slowly, with a deliberation that froze my blood, the old man turned his head toward me. His eyes were a gray so pale they seemed almost white, as if the decades had been erasing the color until leaving only a ghostly vestige. And when they looked at me, I felt something cold piercing my chest, a physical sensation of invasion, as if those eyes could see beyond my body and penetrate directly into my soul. He pronounced my full name, my first name, my two last names, articulated with perfect clarity, contrasting with the unintelligible murmur from before. And then, a date. March 15th of the following year. The words fell into the silence of the platform like stones thrown into a well, sinking into my consciousness with a finality leaving no room for doubt. Before I could react, before I could form a question or demand an explanation, the sound of the approaching train filled the platform. The characteristic whistle, the screech of brakes on tracks, the metallic rumble of cars getting closer. I looked away from the old man for barely a second, an automatic instinct to look toward the source of the sound. When I turned my head back, he had disappeared. The bench was empty, with no trace of his presence. He hadn't had time to get up and walk away. He had simply vanished as if he had never been there. The trip back home passed in a haze of confusion and contained terror. I sat in one of the seats by the window and fixed my gaze on my own reflection on the dark glass, a pale and decomposed face I barely recognized as mine. I tried to convince myself it had been a hallucination, an effect of accumulated fatigue, of the cold that had crept into my bones during the wait. But the memory of those gray eyes, of my name pronounced by lips that shouldn't know it, of that date now etched in my mind with the permanence of a scar, refused to fade no matter how much I tried to rationalize it. Elena was waiting up for me when I arrived. Sitting on the living room sofa with an open book on her lap she clearly hadn't been reading. Lucas was already asleep in his room, but she had wanted to make sure I got home okay, given the train delay. Her face lit up with a smile of relief when she saw me enter, but the smile vanished quickly upon seeing my expression. She asked if something had happened, if I was okay, and I forced a smile I knew was unconvincing while assuring her I was just tired. I told her what happened while we ate the leftovers she had saved for me. I tried to give the story a light tone, presenting it as a curious anecdote about an eccentric old man in a lonely station. I omitted the most disturbing details. The fact that he had pronounced my full name, the date he had recited alongside it. She laughed with that laugh of hers that always managed to make me feel everything was okay, and joked about the strange characters one encountered on public transport late at night. Her laughter comforted me enough to sleep that night, although my dreams were populated by empty platforms and gray eyes watching me from the shadows. But the comfort didn't last long. 3 days later, while eating breakfast before work, with Lucas sitting across from me devouring his cereal and Elena making her coffee in the kitchen, I saw the news on a digital paper. A traffic accident on the outskirts of the city had claimed the lives of 4 people early that morning. A truck had collided head-on with a vehicle, killing all occupants. Among the victims' names, I recognized one. It was one of the names the old man had murmured that night on the platform, and the date of the accident matched exactly the one the old man had recited next to that name. My coffee went cold in my hands while I reread the news over and over. The name was uncommon, a combination not easily repeated, and the date had been pronounced with a precision, leaving no room for doubt. It wasn't a coincidence. Over the following weeks, I started paying attention to the news obsessively. Every morning I checked obituaries, accident reports, any mention of deaths. I created a spreadsheet where I noted the names I remembered next to the dates the old man had pronounced. The results were devastating. One after another, the names appeared. A 43-year-old woman dead from a sudden heart attack. A 27-year-old man drowned in a pool. An older man dead in his sleep. Not all names matched. Some I never found, perhaps because I hadn't heard them clearly or because they belonged to people from other cities. But the ones I did find, 7 in total over 2 months, were enough to destroy any hope that this had been a product of my imagination. Certainty settled inside me like slow-acting poison. The old man wasn't a harmless lunatic or a hallucination. He was something else, something that knew people's death dates before they happened. And he had pronounced my name next to a date approaching inexorably. Elena was the first to notice the change. She asked why I spent so much time reading obituaries, why I had become so quiet during dinners, why sometimes I stared into space with an expression she described as someone very far away. I invented excuses about work stress, a difficult project having me worried. She pretended to believe me, but I saw in her eyes she knew I was hiding something. Our relationship started suffering under the weight of that secret I couldn't share. Lucas noticed too, in his own way. He had that sensitivity some children possess to pick up on adults' emotions. He started seeking my closeness more, asking me to tuck him in every night, hugging me with a force that seemed to want to convey something he couldn't express with words. One night, while reading him a bedtime story, he interrupted to ask if I was sick. I told him no, that I was just tired. He looked at me with those big eyes he had inherited from his mother and told me he didn't want me to ever leave. That night I cried for the first time in memory. I waited for Elena to fall asleep, went to the bathroom, turned on the faucet to drown any sound, and let the tears flow. I cried for the fear consuming me, for the helplessness of not knowing what to do, for the certainty that something terrible awaited me. I cried for my son, who deserved a present father. I cried for my wife, suffering in silence without knowing how to help me, but maybe there was something I could do. The idea emerged gradually, fed by desperation. If the old man had known those names, if he had known the dates before they happened, maybe he knew something else. Maybe there was a reason he had looked directly at me, why he had pronounced my name aloud. To find out, I needed to find him again. I started frequenting the station where I had seen him. Every night after work, I invented excuses to leave the house and took the train to that stop. I stayed on the platform for hours, watching every passenger, looking for the figure of the old man with his anachronistic suit and dark wooden cane. Elena thought I was working overtime, and I fed that lie with an ease that shamed me. Weeks turned into months. Winter gave way to a cold and rainy spring. The date was getting closer and closer. March 15th. Less than 3 weeks remained, and I still hadn't found answers. It was my co-worker, Roberto, who provided the first real clue. We had coincided on a project over the last few months, and one afternoon, while having coffee, I casually mentioned my interest in urban legends. He looked at me with a strange expression and told me a story his grandmother had told him as a child. In the region where she grew up, there was a legend of a man appearing at train stations to announce travelers' deaths. They called him the accountant, because he kept count of all those who were going to die, knowing their names and dates with supernatural precision. According to the legend, he wasn't an evil being or a demon. He was simply a witness, someone designated to carry the burden of knowing what others couldn't know. I asked him if his grandmother had mentioned any way to escape the prediction. He shrugged and said he didn't remember, that it was just a story to scare children. But there was something in his look suggesting he wasn't so sure himself. That night I searched for information about the legend online. I found scattered mentions in folklore forums, testimonies from people claiming to have had similar experiences. The accountant, the announcer, the man at the station. He had many names in different cultures, but the description was always similar. An elderly man dressed in clothes from another era, appearing in places of transit and reciting names and dates. In one of the forums I found a testimony that froze my blood. A woman claimed to have heard her name from the accountant's lips 5 years ago. She had desperately sought a way to escape, consulting mediums, priests, healers, and finally she had found something. The accountant didn't announce inevitable deaths, she wrote. He announced probable deaths, destinies that could still be altered. The key was in listening carefully. The accountant didn't just recite names and dates. He also murmured something else, almost inaudible words preceding each name, words containing the key to avoid the announced fate. Whoever managed to hear those words could change what was written. The woman claimed to have managed to hear his message and survived the announced date, but she didn't specify what she had heard or what she had changed. The testimony ended with a warning. The accountant only appeared once before each person. Whoever didn't pay attention in that single encounter lost their chance forever. I reread those words with desperation. I had had my encounter. I had heard my name and my date, but I hadn't heard anything else. Then I remembered something. Just before the old man pronounced my name, he had said something else. Words I had dismissed at that moment as part of his incoherent murmur. I closed my eyes and tried to reconstruct that moment, to rescue from my memory the syllables I had ignored. The memory came in fragments. The old man had pronounced a phrase before my name, a phrase in a language sounding like Latin, and within that phrase, there was a word standing out above the rest. Trivium. I spent days researching, looking for that word in Latin dictionaries and glossaries of archaic terms, and finally I found it. It wasn't a name or a place. It was a concept meaning crossroads or point of decision, a moment where paths forked and the choice taken determined the rest of the journey. The revelation hit me hard. The accountant hadn't announced an inevitable death to me. He had pointed out a crossroads, a moment where I would have to make a decision determining if I lived or died. March 15th wasn't the date of my death. It was the date of my choice. But what choice? What decision would I have to make that day? I reviewed my plans for that date. It was an absolutely normal day. I would go to work, come home, have dinner with my family. Nothing seeming like a life or death crossroads. The final days before the date were a torment of anticipation. Every morning I woke up with the certainty that the end was approaching. Elena asked me several times if there was something I wanted to tell her. I was about to do it, to confess everything. But every time I tried to form the words, something stopped me. I didn't want to burden her with that weight. March 15th dawned gray and rainy. I got up before the rest of the family and sat in the kitchen, watching raindrops slide down the window. Every minute passing was one less moment in the countdown. Elena got up shortly after, made Lucas's breakfast, walked him to the school bus. I watched her say goodbye with a kiss on his forehead, and something in my chest contracted painfully. The day passed with a normality I found almost offensive. I went to work, attended meetings, answered emails. No one around me seemed to notice the day was different, that for at least one person, destiny was about to be decided. It was on the way home when it happened. The train was fuller than usual, and I had to stand holding onto one of the metal poles. Next to me was a young woman with a small child in her arms who wouldn't stop crying. The woman tried to calm him, but nothing worked. The other passengers looked at her with barely concealed annoyance, but no one offered help. The train stopped between two stations. A breakdown on the tracks, the conductor announced. The wait would last at least half an hour. The woman with the child seemed on the verge of tears, exhausted by her son's crying and the reproachful looks. That was when I saw him. At the back of the car, almost hidden among the mass of bodies, was the old man. The same anachronistic suit, the same dark wooden cane, the same gray eyes now looking directly at me, piercing the distance as if no one else existed. His lips moved, forming words I couldn't hear but somehow understood. This was the moment, the crossroads, the decision that would determine everything coming after. I looked at the woman with the child. I looked at the old man. I looked at the other passengers, each locked in their bubble of indifference. And then I understood what I had to do. I approached her and asked if she needed help. She looked at me with a mix of surprise and relief. I offered to hold the child while she looked for something in her bag, a bottle she had prepared but hadn't been able to give him for lack of free hands. I held the child for several minutes. He was a warm, living weight in my arms, a reminder of what really mattered in life. The child stopped crying almost immediately. When the woman took her son back and thanked me with an exhausted smile, I felt something change inside me. A knot that had been squeezing my chest for months began to loosen. I looked toward where the old man had been. The space was empty. He had vanished as silently as he had appeared, leaving only the echo of a decision made. The train resumed its journey shortly after. I arrived home more than an hour late. Elena welcomed me with relief. She had seen the news about the breakdown. Lucas ran to hug me as soon as he saw me, and I lifted him in my arms, feeling his weight as something precious, something I had been about to lose. That night, after putting Lucas to bed and having dinner with Elena, I went out to the balcony and looked at the city lights. March 15th was ending, and I was still alive. I didn't know for sure if the crossroads had been real, if my decision to help that woman had been what saved me. But I knew something for certain. I had spent months living with fear, obsessed with a date I believed marked my end, and in that time, I had neglected what really mattered. My wife, who had supported me without knowing what I was facing. My son, who only wanted his father to be present. Myself, who had forgotten how to live in the present, being too worried about the future. 2 years have passed since that night on the train. I haven't seen the accountant again, and I no longer look for him. I have learned to live without the certainty of knowing how much time I have left, accepting that no one has that information, and that perhaps it is better that way. What I do have is the present, every day that dawns with its promise of new choices, new crossroads. Elena and I have rebuilt what the secret had eroded between us. I told her everything, finally, one summer night several months later. She listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she hugged me for a time I couldn't measure. She didn't tell me if she believed me or not. She only told me she was there, that she would always be there. Lucas has grown, as children grow, too fast. He no longer asks me to tuck him in every night, but he still seeks my closeness in other ways. Every moment with him is a gift I don't take for granted, a crossroads where I choose to be present. Sometimes when I take the train late at night, I look at the other passengers and wonder how many of them have heard their name from the lips of a mysterious old man. How many are living with the weight of a date etched in their mind, and how many have found, like me, that the true message wasn't in the prediction but in what we choose to do with it. The accountant is still out there in some lonely station, murmuring names and dates to travelers who don't know they are being warned. I don't know if he is an angel, a demon, or something completely different. What I know is his function isn't to condemn us but to wake us up, to remind us that life is a journey with an inevitable end, but with a path that is in our hands. And every time I choose compassion over indifference, every time I stop to help someone in need, every time I'm present for my family instead of losing myself in worries about a future I can't control, I feel I am honoring the lesson I learned that March 15th. Death will come when it has to come. But meanwhile, I have the opportunity to live in a way that makes every day count. That is the true crossroads, the choice we make every morning upon waking. Airports have always seemed like strange places to me. Transit spaces where no one truly belongs and where time seems to function differently than in the rest of the world. They are places designed for people to pass through without staying, to wait a few hours before leaving for somewhere else, to consume expensive coffee and magazines they won't read while staring at screens announcing distant destinations. I've spent hundreds of hours in them throughout my career, waiting for delayed flights, making impossible connections, sleeping in uncomfortable seats while waiting for sunrise. But none of those experiences prepared me for what happened that November night in an airport whose name I prefer not to remember. My name is Gerardo. I'm 34 years old, and I work as a sales rep for an industrial machinery company that manufactures lathes, milling machines, and precision equipment for workshops and factories across the country. My job consists of visiting those factories and workshops, presenting our products to purchasing managers, negotiating contracts, and closing sales that sometimes take months to finalize. It's a job that forces me to travel constantly, to spend more nights in hotels than in my own bed, and to know airports and train stations as if they were extensions of my own home. My girlfriend Valentina always says I'm more married to my rolling suitcase than to her, and she's probably right. We've been together for 4 years, and I've spent half that time on roads and in terminals, promising her that someday I'll ask for an office position and stop living like a perpetual nomad. She works as a graphic designer from home, which means she can wait for me at any hour without her work suffering, although I know she finds it increasingly hard to understand why I choose a profession that keeps me away from her so many days a year. That night I was returning from an industrial fair where I had spent 3 days presenting a new line of automated CNC lathes that promised to revolutionize the production of precision parts. I was exhausted, with that deep tiredness that accumulates after endless days of smiling at strangers, repeating the same sales pitch over and over, and feigning enthusiasm for technical features I already knew by heart. I had closed 2 major contracts and had 3 others in negotiation, which meant my boss would be happy. But at that moment, the only thing I wanted was to get home, hug Valentina, and sleep in my own bed for at least 12 hours straight. My connecting flight left at 11 at night and arrived home at 2 in the morning, which meant I would be in my bed around 3 if everything went well. Valentina was waiting up for me, or so she had promised in the last message she sent before I boarded the first flight. She had sent me a photo of herself on the sofa with a blanket and a cup of tea, saying she had a romantic movie ready to watch together when I arrived. I replied with a heart emoji and promised I would try not to fall asleep in the car on the way home. The airport was one of those medium-sized ones serving as a hub for regional connections, with 2 terminals connected by an endless corridor and a limited selection of shops and cafes that closed too early. It wasn't an airport I knew well because I usually made my connections in larger, better-equipped ones. But the flight I found was the cheapest, and my company always insisted on optimizing travel expenses. I arrived at my gate with an hour to spare, sat in one of those hard plastic seats that seemed designed to cause back pain, and took out my phone to kill time watching videos and answering emails that had piled up during the fair. That was when I heard the first announcement informing that Flight 7741 to the capital was delayed due to adverse weather conditions and that the new estimated departure time was 1 in the morning. I sighed with resignation because delays were a regular part of my frequent traveler life. I had lost count of the times I had to reorganize my plans because of storms, technical breakdowns, or just bad luck. 2 hours of waiting were nothing compared to some of the logistical nightmares I had lived through over the years. I sent a message to Valentina letting her know about the change of plans. She replied with a sad but understanding emoji, and I settled into the seat ready to wait as long as necessary. The terminal wasn't very crowded at that time of night. There were about 20 or 30 people scattered around the boarding area, most looking at their phones with that absorbed expression we all adopt when killing time, or sleeping with their heads resting on backpacks and purses improvised as pillows. A family with 2 small children tried to keep them entertained with an iPad, while the little ones complained they wanted to go home. A group of suited executives spoke in low voices near the next gate, probably discussing some business that couldn't wait. An older woman was reading a book with worn covers without looking up from the pages, completely oblivious to the bustle around her. The first hour passed without noteworthy events. I bought a coffee from a vending machine that spat out a watery, lukewarm liquid barely deserving of the name, and drank it while watching videos on my phone with headphones on, trying not to think about how uncomfortable the seat was. When I looked up to check the information board, I noticed the terminal had emptied considerably. The family with children had disappeared, probably found a quieter corner where the little ones could sleep. The executives had also left, perhaps to some VIP lounge. Maybe a dozen of us remained waiting at the gate, all with that expression of resigned fatigue characterizing night travelers. That was when I heard the second announcement informing that the flight suffered an additional delay, and the new estimated departure time was 3 in the morning. A murmur of frustration ran through the small group of passengers remaining. Some people got up cursing under their breath, others simply sighed with resignation. A man of about 50, looking like a successful businessman, expensive suit, albeit wrinkled from hours of waiting, and a gold watch on his wrist, got up from his seat and walked decisively to the information desk next to the gate. But the desk was empty. There was no airline employee behind the glass, just a sign saying they would assist shortly. The man returned to his seat with a confused and visibly annoyed expression. I looked around searching for some airport staff member, but saw no one. No employee in uniform, no security guard patrolling, no cleaning worker. The cafe at the end of the hall had its lights off and the shutter down, even though according to the schedule it should be open 24 hours. The newsstand was also closed with a metal grate down that I didn't remember seeing when I passed by just an hour ago. I tried not to give it importance because I knew airports reduced staff during night hours. Probably the airline staff had gone to rest while waiting for news on the storm status. Everything had a logical explanation if one stopped to think about it calmly. I took out my phone to send another message to Valentina notifying her of the new delay, but the screen showed something that made me frown with concern. No signal. The signal bars had disappeared completely. I checked the airport Wi-Fi connection, but it wasn't working either. The list of available networks appeared empty. I restarted the phone thinking it was a device glitch, waited for it to turn on again and checked, but the result was the same. No signal, no Wi-Fi, no way to communicate with the outside world. I looked around and saw other passengers also looking at their phones with similar expressions of confusion. A woman was shaking her phone as if that could make the signal return. A man was raising his arm in different directions, searching for reception. Everyone seemed to be experiencing the same problem. A young man sitting next to me took off his wireless headphones and looked at me, commenting that his signal was failing too, and that it was probably due to the storm, that sometimes electrical storms affected the antennas. His name was Dimas, and he was about 25, maybe a few years younger. He was a computer programmer at a startup and was returning home after a tech conference. He had that disheveled look of someone who has spent too many hours in front of screens. Stubble, pronounced dark circles under his eyes, and a black t-shirt with a programming joke only other coders would understand. I liked him immediately, perhaps because his relaxed attitude toward problems contrasted with the unease starting to grow in my stomach, without me being able to explain exactly why. I asked him how long he had been waiting, and he said since 10, that the first delay was half an hour, then they announced another hour, then 2 additional hours, and that he had lost count of how many announcements they had made promising the flight would leave soon. I looked at the wall clock above the gate. It was almost 2 in the morning. I had been in that terminal for more than 3 hours, and the flight kept getting delayed without anyone giving us clear information. I asked Demas if he had seen anyone from the airline staff because I wanted to ask if there was any updated information. He told me he hadn't seen anyone for quite a while, that he assumed they would all be in some office waiting for news from the control tower about the storm status. I decided to stretch my legs and look for someone who could give me information about the flight status. I told Demas I'd be right back and walked away from the gate down the main terminal corridor, toward where I remembered seeing a general information desk. What I saw while walking left me with a cold feeling in my stomach that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. The terminal was completely empty. There wasn't a single passenger at any of the other gates flanking the corridor. Not an employee behind the check-in counters. No security guards patrolling in their uniforms. No cleaning staff pushing carts. Absolutely no one in the entire space my sight could reach. All the shops were closed with metal grates down shining under the fluorescent ceiling light, even those that, according to their signs, should be open 24 hours. The cafes had chairs up on the tables as if they had been closed for hours. The newsstand showed empty displays behind glass no one had cleaned in a long time. The whole terminal looked abandoned, as if everyone had been evacuated without telling us. The information screens hanging from the ceiling at regular intervals showed something that made me stop dead with my heart beating a little faster. Only one flight appeared on the entire departure list. Flight 7741 to the capital. My flight. Status: delayed. Estimated departure time pending confirmation. All other flights that should appear on the list had disappeared as if they had never existed. I walked faster, passing empty and silent gates whose numbers ascended normally as I advanced down the hall. 23, 24, 25, 26, 27, 28, 29. The sound of my footsteps echoed in the terminal silence in an unsettling way. But when I reached gate 30, where the corridor should end in a wall with signs for restrooms and emergency exits, the corridor didn't end. It continued forward, entering a terminal zone I didn't remember seeing when I arrived at the airport. A zone that seemed to extend toward infinity under the same fluorescent light. The gate numbers kept increasing, but in an increasingly erratic way. 31, 32, 33, 34. And then, without any logical transition, they jumped to impossible numbers that made no sense. 47, 89, 156, 203, 15, 892. The gates still looked the same as the others, with their rows of empty seats and abandoned counters. But the numbers identifying them defied any architectural logic. I stopped in front of gate 156, feeling the cold in my stomach had turned into a knot of anxiety. Through the glass facing the runway, only total darkness was visible. No runway lights, no waiting planes, no service vehicles. Nothing suggesting there was anything on the other side. Just absolute black, as if the airport ended abruptly in a void that shouldn't exist. I turned on my heels and walked back toward where I had left the other passengers, with my heart beating faster and faster and my palms damp with cold sweat. Something was very wrong in that place. Something I couldn't explain with storms or delays or lack of night staff. When I reached gate 23, I counted the passengers remaining waiting for the flight. We were 8 in total, including myself. Demas was still in his seat looking at his phone with a furrowed brow. The 50-year-old businessman had fallen asleep with his head thrown back and mouth slightly open. The older woman with the book kept reading as if nothing had changed around her. There was also a young couple hugging in a corner, him with his head resting on her shoulder. A woman of about 40 looking like a stressed executive was typing on a laptop, although it was evident there could be no connection. And finally, an old man with completely white hair and wrinkled skin sat very upright in his seat, looking toward the gate with an indecipherable expression. I approached Demas and sat next to him, telling him in a low voice what I discovered. The completely empty terminal, the total absence of staff, the information panels showing only our flight while all others had disappeared. Demas got up and looked down the hall where I had come from. His expression changed slightly when he verified there was indeed no one in sight. He told me it was a bit weird, but surely there was a logical explanation. Maybe they had evacuated the airport because of the storm and simply hadn't warned us. I decided to check the exits to see if there was any way to leave the terminal. I approached the automatic glass doors connecting the boarding area with the corridor leading to check-in and security control. The doors didn't open when I approached. They remained closed, motionless as if the automatic mechanism had stopped working. I pushed the glass with my hands trying to force them open, but they were completely locked. I tried other doors, the emergency ones that according to signs should open simply by pushing the metal bar. The ones leading to service areas marked as authorized personnel only. The ones connecting to restrooms and escalators, all closed. All locked, all impossible to open. We were trapped in that terminal with no visible way out. I went back to the other passengers and explained what I had discovered, speaking loud enough for everyone to hear. The reactions were varied. The young couple got up immediately with alarmed expressions and went to check the doors themselves. The businessman woke up with the noise and started demanding explanations in an authoritative tone. The executive woman closed her laptop with a sigh of frustration and said this was completely unacceptable and she planned to file a formal complaint. Only the white-haired old man and the older woman with the book remained calm in their seats, showing no surprise or alarm at my words, as if nothing I was telling them was new or unexpected. I approached the old man and sat in the empty seat next to him, asking if he wasn't worried about what was happening. The old man looked at me with gray, watery eyes that seemed tired in a way that went beyond simple physical exhaustion. He asked me how long I had been waiting, and I said about 3 hours, that I had arrived around 10 at night. He nodded slowly and told me he had arrived on Tuesday. I stared at him uncomprehendingly, pointing out that today was Thursday. That meant he had been waiting there for more than 2 days. The old man confirmed my words with a sad smile that wrinkled his face even more. The woman with the book looked up from her pages for the first time since I had arrived at the terminal. She had eyes sunken in their sockets, and skin so pale it seemed almost translucent under the fluorescent light. She told me she had arrived 3 weeks ago, or maybe longer, she wasn't entirely sure anymore, because days blended together when there was no way to distinguish day from night. The cold I felt at that moment had absolutely nothing to do with the air conditioning. I told them that was impossible, that you couldn't be trapped in an airport for weeks without anyone coming to look for you. The old man pointed with a trembling finger toward the information board, where Flight 7741 continued to show eternally as delayed, explaining that flight had been delayed since the moment he arrived, that it was always about to leave, that there was always a new estimated time never met, but the plane never reached the gate. The young couple returned from checking the doors with panicked expressions, confirming they were all closed and there was no way out. No one had an answer to offer. The following hours were a confused mix of frustration, growing fear, and stubborn denial. The businessmen insisted repeatedly that this was simply a serious administrative error, and someone would come to fix it any moment. The executive woman drafted furious complaint emails on her laptop, even though she was perfectly aware she couldn't send them without a connection. Demas tried to hack some Wi-Fi network using programs he had installed, but all his attempts ended in failure. The young couple hugged in silence in their corner, slowly processing what was happening. I decided to explore the airport more thoroughly. Unable to sit waiting, doing nothing, I ventured into the corridor of gates with impossible numbers, walking past digits following no logical sequence. 203, 15, 892, 4, 567, 12. Some gates led to empty waiting rooms identical to ours in every aspect. Other gates led to corridors extending into absolute darkness with no light illuminating them. Corridors that seemed endless. And one gate, the one bearing the number 0 etched on a rusted sign, led to something that made me back away several steps with my heart pounding against my ribs. It was a waiting room identical to ours, with the same rows of seats and the same signs and the same information boards. But it was full of people. Dozens of people sitting in the plastic seats looking toward a gate showing the same flight 7741. But none of those people moved. None breathed. None blinked. They were completely motionless, like wax figures in a museum of horrors, eyes open and fixed on some point in infinity. I recognized some of the postures with a chill running down my spine. A man of about 50 in an expensive suit asleep with his head thrown back. Exactly like our businessman. A 40-year-old woman with a laptop open on her knees, just like our executive. A young couple hugging in a corner, in the same position as the two kids in our group. They were us. Or more accurately, they were what remained of other groups of passengers who had been in our same situation before and had ended up turned into those motionless statues. I ran back to our gate, not daring to look back. When I arrived, I was hyperventilating so hard I had to lean against the wall for several seconds not to faint. I told Demas everything I had found in a broken voice. The waiting room full of motionless figures, the people who seemed frozen in time, the postures repeating as if they were copies of ourselves. The old man listened to my account without showing the slightest surprise, confirming he had already seen that room. That was why he didn't try to leave there or look for explanations that didn't exist, because he knew what happened to those who stopped waiting. I asked him what that place was, and he said he didn't know exactly. That maybe it was a limbo for lost travelers, a trap for souls in transit, or a glitch in the fabric of reality trapping those unlucky enough to cross it. The only thing he knew for certain was that the flight never arrived, the doors never opened, and those who stopped waiting ended up in those rooms turned into statues. I asked him what stopping waiting meant, and he explained that when one completely lost hope that the flight would arrive someday, when one accepted deep in their being that they were trapped forever without possibility of escape, something took them to those rooms. One became one of those motionless figures, continued existing physically but was no longer really oneself, no longer thought, no longer felt, no longer waited for anything. The woman with the book closed her volume for the first time and looked me directly in the eyes, explaining that was why she kept reading non-stop. That was why the old man kept looking toward the gate as if the plane were going to appear any moment. As long as they kept waiting actively, as long as they maintained even a tiny spark of hope that the flight could arrive, they remained themselves. The businessman, who had been listening to our conversation with growing indignation, approached furiously, declaring this was absolutely ridiculous, that we were all completely crazy, and that he was going to find a way out of that damn airport even if he had to break a window with his own hands. He walked away down the hall with decisive steps full of determination, his figure shrinking as he advanced toward the terminal zones I had explored earlier. No one tried to stop him because we all knew it would be useless. The old man simply shook his head while watching him leave. The businessman never returned. The hours passed with exasperating slowness. Or maybe they were minutes that seemed like hours, or days that seemed like minutes. It was impossible to know because all the airport clocks had stopped at the exact same time, and our phones always showed the same immutable figure, 3:33 in the morning, the time when time had stopped advancing in that place. The executive woman was the next to leave. She announced she didn't plan to sit waiting like an idiot while her career went down the drain, that she was going to find the airline's headquarters and personally demand they get her out of there. She left dragging her rolling briefcase. The sound of the wheels on the terminal floor faded until disappearing completely. She never returned. 6 of us remained in the waiting room, then 5 when the young couple decided to explore together in search of an exit, promising they would return soon with news. They didn't return. Then 4 when Demas said he needed to go to the bathroom and walked away down the hall with his backpack slung over his shoulder. I waited for what seemed like hours, but he never returned. I was left alone with the old man and the woman with the book, the 2 veterans of that impossible place, the 2 survivors who had learned to stay alive simply by staying still and waiting, feeding that small flame of hope, keeping them human. I asked the old man how long he had really been there, and he confessed he honestly didn't know. That time in that place didn't work linearly like in the outside world. That sometimes it seemed only a few hours had passed since he arrived, and other times it seemed entire years had elapsed. I asked if he had ever really tried to escape, and he told me at first he tried with all his might, that he explored every corner of the airport looking for an exit, that he found things that shouldn't exist in any building built by human hands, doors opening to places that were definitely not of this world, corridors changing configuration every time he walked them, rooms appearing and disappearing without any logic. And always, no matter what direction he took or how much he walked, he ended up returning there to that gate number 23, waiting for a flight that would never arrive. The woman with the book turned a page of her endless volume with thin, pale fingers, adding that the only thing they could do was wait patiently, that as long as they waited with faith, they continued existing as people, and when they stopped waiting, they would become a permanent part of that place. I looked toward the gate where Flight 7741 continued to show stubbornly as delayed on the luminous panel. I thought of Valentina waiting for me at home with her blanket and her tea and her romantic movie. I thought of my empty bed. I thought of the whole life I had left behind when I crossed the doors of this terminal, without knowing I would never cross them in the opposite direction. And then I heard something that made me snap my head up. An announcement informing that boarding for Flight 7741 to the capital would begin shortly at gate number 23, and asking us to have our boarding passes ready. The old man and the woman with the book exchanged a look loaded with meaning. The old man commented in a cautious voice that this was completely new, that in all the time he had been there, they had never announced the start of boarding. I got up from my seat looking toward the gate with my heart racing. The lights of the jet bridge to the plane had turned on, casting a yellowish glow into the terminal. Through the glass, I could clearly distinguish the unmistakable silhouette of a commercial airplane waiting on the runway. A plane that definitely hadn't been there a moment before, that had appeared out of nowhere. I thought maybe we could finally leave there. That maybe all this had just been a very long delay, and now at last they were going to let us board. The woman with the book shook her head slowly, warning me not to get on that plane, that it wasn't a real plane, but another trap of that place, another way to make me lose the hope keeping me alive. But I was already walking toward the gate, unable to resist the temptation to escape after so many hours or days or weeks trapped in that terminal. The possibility of returning home, of hugging Valentina, of sleeping in my own bed was too tempting. The glass door opened automatically when I approached, something that hadn't happened with any of the other doors. The jet bridge was lit with that whitish fluorescent light characteristic of airports. At the end of the tunnel, I could perfectly see the open door of the plane waiting for me. I took a decisive step into the jet bridge and then heard the old man's voice echoing behind me, warning me that if I got on that plane, I would never return, that he was telling me as someone who had seen many others make the same mistake. I stopped with one foot inside the jet bridge and the other still in the terminal, paralyzed by doubt. I looked back. The old man and the woman with the book remained sitting in their seats, looking at me with expressions mixing infinite sadness and total resignation. The old man explained that others had tried before me, that many others had boarded the plane completely convinced it would take them home, but the plane never really took off. It only took the passengers to some place from which no return was possible, a place even worse than that eternal waiting room. I looked again toward the plane waiting at the end of the jet bridge. Through the round windows, I could distinguish figures sitting in the interior seats. Completely motionless figures that reminded me with a chill of the ones I had seen in the waiting room of gate number 0. I took a step back, moving away from the jet bridge. The glass door closed in front of me with a pneumatic sound that sounded strangely like a sigh of disappointment, as if the airport itself regretted having lost another victim. The jet bridge lights turned off instantly, and when I looked through the glass toward the runway again, the plane had disappeared completely. The runway was empty and plunged into absolute darkness, as if the plane had never existed. I dragged my feet back to my seat next to the old man and the woman with the book. Neither of them said anything because it wasn't necessary. We all knew what had been about to happen. I don't know how long I've been trapped here since that night. The hours blend with the days, blending with the weeks that perhaps blend with the months or years. The information panel continues to show Flight 7741 tirelessly as delayed. The announcements continue, promising periodically that boarding will begin soon. The exit doors remain hermetically sealed. Sometimes new passengers appear at the gate, materializing out of nowhere with expressions of confusion and fatigue, identical to the one I must have had when I arrived. I patiently tell them what I know about this place, just as the old man told me. Some believe me and sit to wait with us, joining our little community of lost souls. Others refuse flatly to accept what I tell them and leave to find an exit that doesn't exist. Those never return. A short while ago, or maybe a long time, the old man stopped being in his usual seat. I didn't see him leave or say goodbye. Simply one day I looked up from my thoughts and his seat was completely empty. Perhaps he finally lost hope after so many years of fruitless waiting. Perhaps he found some way to escape I don't know about. Or perhaps he became one of those motionless figures populating the rooms of impossible gates. The woman with the book is still here with me, turning the pages of a book that seems endless, always having more chapters to read no matter how many pages she turns. Sometimes we exchange a few words. Sometimes we simply keep each other company in the shared silence of our endless wait. And I keep waiting with all the faith I have left, because as long as I wait with genuine hope, as long as I sincerely believe the flight can arrive at any moment, I remain myself. I remain Gerardo, 34 years old, industrial machinery sales rep, boyfriend of a woman named Valentina who has probably given me up for lost human being with memories of a life I find increasingly hard to recall clearly. Sometimes I wonder if Valentina is still waiting for me somewhere in the real world. If she has moved on with her life after my inexplicable disappearance. If she thinks of me from time to time, or if she has forgotten me completely. Sometimes I wonder if time passes the same outside this airport as inside it. If days or years or decades have elapsed since I entered through those automatic doors now remaining eternally closed. Sometimes I wonder if there is anyone out there in the real world who can hear my story and come rescue us from this prison of glass and fluorescence. But above all, I wonder, in the darkest moments of this endless wait, how much longer I can keep hope alive before becoming another of those motionless figures staring eternally toward a gate, waiting forever for a flight that will never arrive. The information panel just updated with a blink. Flight 7741. Status delayed. New estimated departure time. Soon. It always says soon. It never says now. Never. I've been working as a custodian at Our Lady of Hope Public School for 34 years, and I can say without fear of contradiction that I know every corner of this building better than my own home. I know the exact creak the third floorboard in the second floor hallway makes when someone steps on it, the particular buzz the fluorescent light in the girls' bathroom emits when it's about to burn out, the sound the heating pipes make when the system kicks on during cold winter mornings. I know the smell of every classroom, the feel of every wall, the exact temperature of every corner in every season of the year. This school is my territory, my silent kingdom when the children leave and the teachers pack up their things and the building remains empty, waiting for me to finish my nightly maintenance rounds. My name is Celedonio. I'm 63 years old and I've been a widower for 8 years. My wife, Encarna, died of cancer that took her in barely 4 months, from diagnosis to funeral. And since then, I've lived alone in a small downtown apartment that feels too big for just one person. I have a son who lives in another city with his family, whom I see a couple of times a year, at Christmas and in the summer if I'm lucky. The rest of the time, my life is reduced to the school, to my night rounds, to the small repairs that always need doing in a building as old as this one. It's a lonely but quiet existence, or at least it was until 3 weeks ago when things started happening that I cannot explain. Our Lady of Hope School was built in 1962 on the site of an old building that was demolished to make room for the new facilities. I always knew there had been something on this land before, but I had never bothered to investigate what exactly it was. An old building, probably in ruins, that the city council decided to tear down to build a school to serve the neighborhood that was growing rapidly at that time. Nothing particularly interesting or relevant to my daily job of keeping the facilities running. But 3 weeks ago, I started noticing strange things during my night shifts. The first time was a Tuesday, shortly after 10 when everyone had already left and I was doing my usual round checking that windows were closed and lights were off. I was walking down the first floor hallway the one leading to the first and second grade classrooms, when I heard a noise that made me stop dead in my tracks. It was a dragging sound, as if someone were moving a chair across the floor, and it was clearly coming from classroom 1B, which was to my right. I stood motionless for a few seconds, listening intently. The sound repeated, that unmistakable screech of metal chair legs scraping against floor tiles. Someone was moving furniture inside a classroom that should have been completely empty. My first reaction was to think some teacher had stayed late working and I hadn't realized it. It happened sometimes, especially when evaluations were approaching and they had to prepare reports or grade exams. So I approached the classroom door and opened it, expecting to find Miss Carmen or Mr. Rodrigo sitting at their desk with a pile of papers in front of them. But the classroom was empty. I turned on the light and scanned the room, looking for any explanation for the sound I had heard. The chairs were all placed on top of the tables as they should be after cleaning. The windows were closed. There was no one hiding behind the chalkboard or under the teacher's desk. Everything was exactly as it should be, in perfect order, with no sign that anyone had been there moving anything. I stood in the center of the classroom for nearly a minute, feeling something I couldn't identify. It wasn't exactly fear. It was more like discomfort. The feeling that something didn't fit, even though I couldn't determine what it was. The classroom smelled, as always, of chalk and Play-Doh, and that particular scent spaces occupied by small children for hours have. The windows showed the darkness of the night and my own reflection looking back at me with a confused expression. Everything seemed normal, and yet something told me it wasn't. Finally, I turned off the light and closed the door, telling myself I had probably heard a pipe creaking or the noise of an animal on the roof that my brain had erroneously interpreted as a chair dragging. Old buildings make strange noises. I knew that better than anyone after 3 decades working here. There was no reason to worry. But the noises continued. The next night I heard footsteps on the second floor when I was on the ground floor checking the electrical panel. Small, quick steps, like those of a child running down the hall, going from one end of the building to the other and then stopping abruptly. I went up the stairs as fast as I could, but when I got to the top there was no one. Just the empty hallway lit by emergency lights, and the dense silence of a school without children. 2 nights later, it was the piano. The school has an old piano in the assembly hall, an instrument no one has played for years because it's out of tune and would need a costly restoration the center's budget cannot afford. But that night, when I passed by the assembly hall on my way to the supply closet, I clearly heard someone pressing the keys. It wasn't a melody, just single notes played at random, as a child would do experimenting with the instrument for the first time. I opened the assembly hall door expecting to find someone sitting at the piano, but the room was empty, and the instrument's lid was down and covered in dust, with no mark indicating anyone had lifted it recently. I started having trouble sleeping. When I got home after my night shifts, I would lie down exhausted, but my mind wouldn't stop racing. Reviewing the sounds I had heard, looking for rational explanations I found increasingly hard to find. During the day, I functioned normally, doing my usual tasks while the school bustled with activity, with children running through the halls and teachers giving their classes. But when evening fell and the building started emptying, I felt a knot in my stomach growing as the time to be alone approached. That was when I started investigating the history of the school. I began at the municipal library, looking for information about the neighborhood and the buildings that had existed before the school's construction. It wasn't easy to find data. Documentation from that era was scattered and poorly organized. But little by little, I gathered pieces of a puzzle that began to form a disturbing image. The building occupying this lot before the school wasn't a private house or an abandoned factory as I had assumed. It was an orphanage. The Provincial Orphanage of San Ildefonso, an institution that operated from 1892 until 1958. When it was closed by health authorities after an inspection, revealed deplorable conditions and reports of mistreatment of the inmates. I found newspaper articles from the time speaking of the orphanage's closure in very vague terms, mentioning hygienic deficiencies and administrative problems, but without going into details about what had really happened inside those walls. It was the kind of euphemistic language used in those times to talk about things no one wanted to name directly, the kind of complicit silence hiding horrors Society preferred not to know. But I also found other documents harder to locate, telling a very different story. In the Provincial Historical Archive, there was a folder with the orphanage's file, including inspection reports made over the years, letters of complaint sent by neighbors and former employees, and finally the report leading to the institution's closure. What I read in those yellowed documents turned my stomach in a way I hadn't experienced since I watched my wife die. The orphanage had been run for more than 40 years by a man named Modesto Villanueva, an individual who, according to all testimonies, treated the children with systematic cruelty, going far beyond simple physical abuse. Punishments included prolonged confinement in cells without light or ventilation, deprivation of food for days, beatings with blunt objects, and what the reports prudishly called abuses of a moral nature, leaving the children traumatized for life. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was what happened to the children who died, because many died. Too many for an orphanage of that size, too many to be attributed to the usual childhood diseases of the time. Records showed a mortality rate 3 times higher than the average for similar institutions, with causes of death repeating suspiciously: accidents, sudden fevers, constitutional weakness. And the bodies of those children, as I discovered in the final inspection report, were not always turned over to the authorities for burial in the municipal cemetery. Many of them were buried on the orphanage grounds themselves, in an area of the backyard Modesto Villanueva had turned into a makeshift cemetery without any legal authorization. When authorities investigated after the closure, they found more than 30 unmarked graves, most containing remains of children aged between 4 and 12. And the orphanage's backyard, according to the blueprints I found in the municipal archive, corresponded exactly with the current location of the playground of Our Lady of Hope School. For several days after discovering that information, I wasn't able to go to work. I called in sick, something I hadn't done in more than 20 years, and stayed home trying to process what I had learned. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the school playground, that space where children played every day without knowing what lay beneath their feet. And I felt a mixture of horror and sadness, leaving me paralyzed. But I couldn't stay hiding forever. The school needed me. My colleagues counted on me, and besides, a part of me needed to go back, needed to understand what was happening in that building built on the bones of forgotten children. I returned to work on a Monday afternoon, just in time for the night shift. My colleagues asked if I was feeling better, and I said yes, that it had just been a stomach bug, nothing serious. I didn't tell them what I had discovered because I didn't know how. I didn't know how to explain our workplace was built on a mass grave of abused and murdered children without them thinking I had gone crazy. That night I decided to do something different. Instead of sticking to my usual rounds, I set out to explore the school in a more systematic way, paying attention to places where the strange phenomena seemed to concentrate. I carried a notebook where I wrote down every noise, every sensation, every anomaly I detected, trying to find a pattern helping me understand what was happening. What I discovered was that the phenomena were more frequent and intense in certain areas of the building. The ground floor classrooms, those facing directly onto the playground, were the most active. Also the basement, an area I rarely visited because only old junk and cleaning supplies were stored there. And the staircase connecting the basement to the ground floor, a narrow, poorly lit staircase I had always found unpleasant without knowing exactly why. It was in the basement where it happened that night. I went down the stairs with a flashlight in one hand and the notebook in the other, determined to explore that area I had been unconsciously avoiding for years. The school basement was a wide, cavernous space with low ceilings supported by concrete columns and unpolished cement floors. The walls were lined with metal shelves full of cardboard boxes, obsolete school supplies, broken furniture waiting to be repaired or discarded. The air smelled of dampness and dust accumulated over decades. I walked through the space, illuminating corners with the flashlight, looking for anything that could explain the phenomena I had experienced. I didn't know exactly what I expected to find. Perhaps some connection to the old orphanage structures that might have survived demolition. Perhaps simply a rational explanation for the noises that had been tormenting me for weeks. What I found was a door. It was at the back of the basement, partially hidden behind a shelf full of cleaning supply boxes. It was an old worm-eaten wooden door, very different from the modern metal doors in the rest of the building. It seemed to belong to another era, another building, and when I saw it I felt a chill run down my spine from top to bottom. I moved the boxes blocking access and stared at the door for several minutes, feeling my heart beating faster and faster. There was a rusty padlock on the latch, but it was open, as if someone had forced it a long time ago and never bothered to close it again. I reached out for the knob and turned it slowly, feeling the mechanism give way with a creak of rusty metal. The door opened inward, revealing a darkness my flashlight barely managed to penetrate. A smell hit my nostrils. A smell of damp earth and something else, something organic and unpleasant, reminding me of the smell of rotting flowers in an abandoned cemetery. I took a step forward, crossing the threshold, and my foot found the first step of a staircase descending into the depths. That staircase shouldn't exist. The school blueprints I had consulted in the municipal archive showed no basement below the level where I stood. The building had been built on the foundations of the old orphanage, yes, but supposedly those foundations had been demolished and filled in before starting new construction. There shouldn't be anything below the school basement except earth and rock. But there was that staircase, descending into a darkness my flashlight couldn't fully illuminate. I started to descend. The steps were stone, worn by the passage of countless feet over decades or perhaps centuries. The walls were old brick covered in saltpeter and mold, so different from the modern concrete of the school basement, it seemed to belong to another world. The air grew colder and damper as I descended, and the organic smell intensified to the point I had to breathe through my mouth not to feel nauseous. The staircase ended after what I calculated to be about 12 feet of descent, depositing me in a narrow corridor extending left and right. The walls were covered in the same damp marks and greenish mold, and the floor was packed earth crunching under my feet with every step I took. I chose to go left for no particular reason and started walking slowly, lighting the way with the flashlight while my heart beat so hard I could feel it in my temples. The corridor curved slightly to the right, and after about 60 feet, opened into a wider chamber, leaving me paralyzed when my flashlight beam revealed what it contained. They were beds. Small iron beds arranged in orderly rows against the walls, like in a hospital or orphanage dormitory. There were 12 in total, 6 on each side of the room, and on some of them remnants of rotten mattresses and blankets turned to rags by time still remained. On the walls were dark stains that could have been dampness but had shapes too irregular, too organic to be simple water leaks. And on the walls there was something else. Marks scratched into the brick made with fingernails or perhaps some sharp object, forming childish words and drawings. Names repeated over and over as if writing them was the only thing preventing them from being forgotten. Drawings of houses with smoking chimneys and smiling suns, the kind of images any child would draw if given paper and pencils. And other things, single words my mind took time to process because I didn't want to accept what they meant. Help. Mama. Hurts. No more. I stood in the center of that room for I don't know how long, feeling tears running down my cheeks without being able to do anything to stop them. That wasn't a forgotten basement or ruins accidentally preserved under the school. That was a punishment cell, a place where they locked up children who misbehaved, a dark, damp hole where they left them alone for days until they learned to obey or until they died. And then I heard the sound. It wasn't the noise of a chair dragging or footsteps running down a hall. It was something much worse. It was the sound of a child crying, a soft, hopeless weeping seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere, a weeping that had been waiting decades for someone to hear it. I spun around looking for the source of the sound, and my flashlight illuminated something that made my heart stop for a second. There was a figure standing in the chamber entrance, blocking the corridor I had come through. It was small, the size of an 8 or 9-year-old child, and wearing what looked like a dirty, torn white nightgown. I couldn't see its face because it was backlit against the darkness of the corridor, but I could see its silhouette perfectly cut out, motionless, watching me. The crying continued but didn't come from that figure. It came from behind me, from somewhere deeper in that complex of tunnels and chambers extending beneath the school. And as I listened, I realized it wasn't just one child crying, it was several, perhaps dozens. A chorus of childish voices crying and moaning and whispering words I couldn't understand. The figure in the entrance moved. It took a step toward me, then another, and with each step it took, the cold in the room intensified until I could see my own breath condensing into small clouds of vapor. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't respond. I wanted to scream, but my throat was closed. I could only stand there while that thing approached slowly, with movements not entirely human, spasmodic, jerky movements like a puppet manipulated by invisible strings. When it was less than 6 feet from me, my flashlight beam finally illuminated its face, and what I saw ripped a scream from me, echoing through the tunnels like the howl of a wounded animal. It wasn't a face. It was what remained of a face, rotten flesh and bones peeking through decomposed skin, empty sockets where eyes should have been, a mouth open in a silent scream, showing small yellowish teeth. It was the corpse of a child who had been dead for decades but somehow kept moving, kept existing, kept looking for something he had never found in life. And then it spoke, not with articulated words, but with something formed directly in my mind, images and sensations hitting me like punches, fragments of memory that weren't mine, but I experienced as if they were. I saw the orphanage as it was 70 years ago. I saw children crowded in freezing dormitories. I saw Modesto Villanueva with his ash wood rod beating backs and heads. I saw the staircase leading to this place and saw children being dragged down while screaming and kicking. I saw slow deaths in the dark, bodies growing cold on those iron beds, souls finding no path to anywhere and staying trapped down here waiting for someone to come find them. 37. That number appeared in my mind with absolute clarity. 37 children had died in this place. 37 souls never receiving a decent burial or a prayer, or even acknowledgement they had ever existed. Their bodies were down here, buried in the walls and under the dirt floor, and their spirits had been wandering the tunnels for decades waiting for someone to find them. The creature that had been a child reached a hand toward me, a fleshless hand with fingers little more than bones held together by dried tendons. And when the tips of those fingers grazed my cheek, I felt a cold so intense it burned my skin, as if it were fire. But it didn't hurt me, it didn't want to hurt me. It wanted me to know. The images kept coming, faster now, more intense. I saw Modesto Villanueva dying of a heart attack in 1953, 5 years before they closed the orphanage, dying in his bed while the children he had tortured for decades watched him from the shadows of his room. I saw the orphanage closing, the superficial investigation, the decision not to dig too deep so as not to find things no one wanted to find. I saw the demolition of the building and the construction of the school, new foundations rising over old foundations without anyone bothering to check what was underneath. I saw school children playing on the playground for 60 years without knowing that beneath their feet rested the remains of other children who never had the chance to play. And I saw what they wanted, what they had been waiting decades for, what they needed to finally be able to rest. They wanted to be remembered. They wanted someone to know their names, someone to tell their story, someone to acknowledge they had existed and that what happened to them was wrong. They didn't want revenge or justice in the legal sense of the word. They just wanted the world to know there were once 37 children in an orphanage who were treated like animals and died alone and scared in the dark, and that should never have happened. The creature withdrew its hand from my cheek and took a step back. The cold began to dissipate slowly, and the chorus of weeping sounding in the background faded until turning into silence. The figure looked at me for a few more seconds with those empty sockets that somehow conveyed more emotion than any pair of human eyes I had ever seen, and then vanished as if it had never been there, leaving me alone in that chamber full of rusty beds and scratched walls. I got out of the tunnels as fast as I could without actually running, climbing the stone stairs and crossing the old wooden door, and traversing the school basement until reaching the ground floor where the air was cleaner, and the fluorescent light seemed the most beautiful thing I had seen in my life. I sat on the hallway floor with my back against the wall and cried for I don't know how long. I cried for those children who had died decades ago. I cried for my wife who was gone. I cried for all the horrors the world hides under layers of silence and oblivion. That was 2 weeks ago. Since then, I've been working on something probably someone else should have done. Someone with more resources and authority than a simple 63-year-old custodian. I've been investigating orphanage records, looking for the names of children who passed through there during the years Modesto Villanueva was in charge. I've contacted local historians and historical memory associations dedicated to recovering forgotten stories of the dictatorship and institutions operating in that era. I've spoken with journalists and council members and anyone willing to listen to me. It hasn't been easy. Many people don't want to stir up the past, don't want to open wounds closed for decades, don't want to face the possibility that beneath a school where children play every day, there is a mass grave of forgotten victims. But little by little things are starting to move. A team of archaeologists has requested permission to survey the playground. A reporter from the local newspaper is preparing a story on the orphanage, and the city council has opened a file to investigate if it is necessary to exhume any remains found and give them a dignified burial. I don't know if we'll manage to get justice for those 37 children. I don't know if we'll ever know all their names or all their stories, but at least the world will know they existed, that they suffered, that they deserved better than what life gave them, and perhaps that will be enough for them to finally rest. I keep working at the school, keep doing my night shifts, keep walking the empty halls when everyone has left. But I'm no longer afraid. I no longer hear chairs dragging or footsteps running down halls or piano notes sounding in the dark. The school is silent now, a different silence than before, a silence that no longer feels oppressive but simply empty. Sometimes, when I pass by the ground floor classrooms or cross the playground on my way to the supply shed, I seem to feel something. It's not a threatening presence or a supernatural cold. It's something subtler, harder to describe. It's as if someone were watching me, but not with malice, with something resembling gratitude. As if 37 pairs of invisible eyes were following me and thanking me in silence for finally listening to them. Or perhaps it's just my imagination, an old lonely man who has seen too much and needs to believe what he did mattered. In any case, I will keep coming to the school every night. I will keep doing my rounds and checking windows are closed and lights are off. I will keep taking care of this building, which is the closest thing to a home I have since Encarna died. And I will keep remembering those children who died here so long ago, so no one ever has to forget them again.